From the heart of Africa, Burkina Faso shines anew.
The Africa Spoke. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful African stories.
For decades, France has called itself a friend of Africa. But one sentence from President Emmanuel Macron told us exactly how he really sees us, as children who cannot think for ourselves. He stood on that stage, smiled for the cameras, and said, "Africa needs guidance from France to function." Guidance. We called it what it really is, control. And that day, something broke inside me. I'm just one of millions in Burkina Faso who've watched our gold, our land, and our dignity flow to Paris for generations. But I never imagined I would live to see the moment a young African leader would stand up, look the French president in the eye, and say, "No more." That man was Ibrahim Traoré. And what he did next didn't just shake Paris, it set fire to the entire post-colonial order. But if you think this is just a simple tale of hero versus villain, you're wrong. Some say he's a savior. Others say he's playing a dangerous game that could cost us everything. So, which is it? When Macron stood there, speaking about Africa as if we were some project France had to supervise, he didn't realize the ground beneath that relationship was already cracking. In the streets of Ouagadougou, life looked normal. Vendors selling fruit, children running through dusty alleys, motorcycles weaving between potholes. But under that calm surface, something was brewing. Ibrahim Traoré had been moving in silence for months. No speeches, no public threats, not even a hint in the local press. Instead, he built a small circle, legal experts, investigators, economists, and sent them digging into something far more dangerous than any gold mine, the books of foreign mining companies. And what they found was worse than any rumor we had whispered about in the markets. Since independence, French-linked companies and their partners had taken over 500 billion worth of gold from Burkina Faso. Only 10 billion ever reached our national treasury. That's not a partnership. That's daylight robbery with a polite accent. I still remember sitting at a tea stall, listening to an older miner explain how the system worked. "Every ounce of gold," he said, "is weighed twice. Once for the official record and once for the real shipment. The official numbers, those went to the government. The real numbers, those went to private vaults in Paris, Lyon, Marseille." To anyone in America watching this, imagine if foreign corporations drained the oil fields of Texas or Alaska for 50 years, shipped 98% of it overseas, and then told Americans it was for their own good. Do you think Congress would just nod along? But here's the twist. Traoré's investigation wasn't just about catching a few bad contracts. It uncovered entire chains of corruption, ministers, foreign diplomats, and yes, direct links to the Élysée Palace itself. Some deals were signed under the table with development aid as a cover. The aid came in one hand, and in the other, billions in gold quietly slipped away. This was no longer a question of economics. It was a question of sovereignty. For the first time in my life, it felt like someone in power was actually ready to take that question seriously. And while Paris thought they still had control, Traoré was setting up something no one expected. He wasn't going to write letters. He wasn't going to beg. He was preparing for a move so bold, so public, that the world wouldn't be able to look away. If you believe that a nation's wealth belongs to its people, not to foreign billionaires, drop your thoughts in the comments. And share this story, because some powers would prefer you never hear it. It started before sunrise. March 15th, a date I will never forget. The air was cool, almost too quiet for a capital city. I was walking to the bakery when I saw the first convoy of unmarked trucks speed past. No sirens, no warning, just black steel and tinted windows. By 6 a.m., they were everywhere. 7 luxury hotels across Ouagadougou, the kind of places most of us could never even walk into, were surrounded. Inside those suites slept men who thought they owned our country. CEOs of the world's most powerful mining corporations. They arrived in private jets, stayed in rooms that cost more per night than many of us earn in a year, and for decades they came and went as they pleased. Not that morning. The first name we heard was Viktor Petrov, the billionaire head of Goldmax Corporation, the man whose company alone had taken billions in gold from our land while paying pennies in taxes. When the special forces entered his suite, he was still in his pajamas. He reached for his phone, maybe to call his private security, maybe to call Paris. Too late. Within minutes, he was in handcuffs, escorted past a line of shocked hotel staff. And it wasn't just him. At the airport, Jean-Claude Dubois of Western Gold Mining tried to make a run for it. His jet was already fueled, engines warming, but the order had gone out hours earlier. All airspace locked down, borders sealed. Soldiers intercepted his convoy before it even reached the tarmac. Then came Michael Thompson of Pacific Resources, caught in a hotel conference room frantically trying to transfer corporate assets out of the country. His open laptop became evidence that would later make headlines around the world. Here's where it gets even more interesting. Many of these arrests happened simultaneously, within minutes of each other. This wasn't chaos. This was precision. Traoré's team had been tracking their movements for weeks, knowing exactly when they would be in the country and where they would sleep. From the street, I watched one of the CEOs step into the back of an armored truck. People whispered around me, some in disbelief, others grinning like they'd just witnessed justice with their own eyes. Now, here's the mini twist. Word began to spread that French embassy officials were frantically calling government offices, demanding the immediate release of their investors. But for the first time in my life, the answer from our side was not yes. It was silence. The phone lines were dead. The old strings Paris used to pull had been cut. If you were standing there with me watching these so-called untouchables dragged into the daylight, you'd understand why the crowd didn't cheer wildly. We weren't celebrating yet. We knew this was just the first blow in a much bigger fight. For my friends in America, imagine seeing the CEOs of the biggest Wall Street firms arrested in their penthouses, assets frozen, and their own government powerless to stop it. How would that look on CNN? And as the sun rose higher over Ouagadougou, one question burned in everyone's mind. If Traoré could bring down these giants, what would he do next? If you think the world should hear what happened after those arrests, share this video, because the next chapter is where the real battle begins. The day after the arrests, our capital didn't wake up to its usual hum of motorcycle engines and market chatter. It woke up to headlines plastered across every kiosk. Traoré seizes mining executives. Evidence of decades of theft. Paris silent. People stood in clusters, reading aloud the details, as if speaking them would make them more real. Then came the press conference. Traoré didn't walk out with bodyguards flanking him or a polished speech in his hand. He carried folders, thick, worn, and heavy with something far more dangerous than weapons. Proof. Page after page, the numbers told a story no one could spin. In just 1 year, Goldmax Corporation had extracted over $500 million worth of gold from the Topoko mine. Do you know how much they declared for taxes? $50 million. The rest, hidden shipments, underreported figures, smuggled bars routed through partner companies in France, Switzerland, and the UAE. Western Gold Mining was no better. Their trick? Selling bars worth $60,000 on paper for just $10,000, funneling the difference into offshore accounts. And Pacific Resources? They took it even further, inflating worker salaries on official records to claim fake tax deductions, while miners barely had enough to eat. I remember a journalist asking if this was just about corporate greed. Traoré's answer cut through the room. This is about sovereignty. If you control a country's wealth, you control its future. France has been doing both for half a century. That statement, clear, blunt, and aimed directly at Paris, exploded across social media. French outlets called it an outrageous accusation. African forums lit up with support. And here's where the controversy deepened. Documents in those folders didn't just implicate corporations. They tied sitting and former French officials to the exploitation. Contracts signed under development aid programs carried the discreet signatures of ministers in Paris. For my American friends watching, think about the Pentagon Papers, but instead of exposing a war, it's exposing a half-century-long economic occupation. And as if that wasn't enough, there was one more twist. Satellite images and drone footage showed convoys leaving mine sites in the dead of night, escorted not by corporate guards but by foreign military personnel. The flags on their uniforms? French. The room went dead silent. Even those who had doubted Traoré couldn't deny what they were seeing. By the end of that day, Paris had released an official statement calling the arrests illegal and the accusations politically motivated. But for us, the people who had lived under this shadow for decades, it didn't matter what they called it. We had seen the proof. If you believe the world should not turn away from evidence like this, tell me in the comments. And if you think France should be held accountable, share this story, because what happened next would push the fight to an entirely new level. When Traoré announced that the mining executives would not be sent back to their home countries, the international press almost laughed. "He can't try them here," they said. "France will never allow it." They were wrong. A week later, in a packed hall turned into a special tribunal, 7 men who once flew in private jets now sat in plain wooden chairs, no French judges, no EU observers. The bench was made up of 7 justices, 3 from Africa, 2 from Asia, 2 from Latin America. Traoré called it justice without colonial fingerprints. From my seat in the back, I could see their faces. Petrov, the Goldmax CEO, kept glancing at the door like he still expected someone important to walk in and rescue him. Dubois of Western Gold Mining sat stiff and pale, hands clenched. Michael Thompson from Pacific Resources didn't even look up. The prosecutor began reading the charges, and the list was staggering. Tax evasion, bribery, illegal land grabs, forced displacement, child labor, environmental destruction on a scale that could be seen from space. Then came the evidence. Emails pulled from corporate servers in Paris and Lyon where executives mocked Burkinabe workers as stupid natives and cheap bodies. A message from Dubois that made the courtroom gasp. Why pay one adult $100 when you can pay 10 children $10 each and they won't complain? And then the photographs. Rivers turned brown and dead from cyanide runoff. Villages flattened to make way for new pits. Children with bare feet and hollow eyes carrying sacks of ore heavier than their own bodies. For my American friends, imagine if this were Appalachia or the Navajo Nation, and leaked documents proved multinational corporations had knowingly poisoned water supplies, uprooted communities, and used children in dangerous work. Would you still call it just business? But the most controversial moment came when a witness took the stand. An elderly woman, Mariam Koulibaly, her voice shaking, told how her village was bulldozed under orders signed in Paris. "They gave us $100, she said, and told us to leave. My parents are buried under that soil. They destroyed everything for gold." That testimony hit me harder than any document, because I knew, deep down, that France wasn't just taking our gold, they were taking our history. The French government released another statement that evening calling the tribunal a violation of international norms. But in our streets, people called it something else. The first real day of freedom. If you believe those who commit crimes against humanity should face justice where the crimes were committed, leave your thoughts below. And if you think the world should hear Mariam's story, share this before it's buried under diplomatic spin. 6 months into the trial, the air in Ouagadougou was electric. You could feel it in the markets, in the bus stations, even in the quiet corners of cafes. Everyone was waiting for the same thing. The verdict. The courtroom was packed to the walls. Journalists from around the world sat shoulder to shoulder with local villagers who had traveled for days just to be there. Some carried photographs of rivers before they were poisoned. Others held faded family portraits of relatives lost to mining accidents. When the chief judge stood, the room went silent. Victor Petrov of Goldmax, 50 years in prison, 10 billion in fines. Jean-Claude Dubois of Western Gold Mining, 45 years, 8 billion in penalties. Michael Thompson of Pacific Resources, life in prison, no parole. Robert Mackenzie of Continental Gold, 40 years. James Harrison of African Minerals, 55 years. Peter Williams of Global Mining Co-op, 60 years. David Anderson of Summit Resources, life without parole. For a moment, it felt like history itself had paused. Then came the twist no one had dared to predict. The court ordered the seizure of everything these men owned, not just in Burkina Faso but worldwide. Their yachts, villas on the French Riviera, private jets, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, art collections locked away in Swiss vaults, all of it. And here's the part that drew both cheers and controversy. Every cent from those assets would go directly to the victims and their families, bypassing government hands entirely. Outside, the streets erupted. Drums, singing, flags waving high. I saw miners embrace in tears, mothers holding their children close, elders raising their fists in pride. But not everyone was celebrating. In Paris, the government condemned the verdict as judicial theft. French business leaders warned this would destroy investor confidence in Africa. The European Union called for immediate dialogue to resolve tensions. For my American friends, imagine if ExxonMobil executives were sentenced to decades in prison abroad, their assets seized, and the U.S. government powerless to stop it. Would Washington defend justice or protect its corporate giants? Even inside our own country, debates flared. Some said this was justice finally served. Others worried about retaliation, sanctions, blockades, even covert destabilization. As I walked home through the celebrating crowd, I knew this wasn't the end of the fight. This was the opening shot in a new war, one where the weapons were no longer just guns, but control over wealth, laws, and truth itself. If you believe justice should never bow to foreign pressure, tell me your thoughts and share this, because what Traoré did next would ensure that no one could ever put Burkina Faso back in chains. 2 days after the verdict, Traoré addressed the nation. No ceremony, no long preamble. Just 12 words that would turn the mining industry on its head. From today, all gold reserves belong to the people of Burkina Faso. It was the kind of announcement that, in the past, would have been followed by phone calls from Paris, London, or Washington, demanding a clarification. This time, those calls came, but no one picked up. In a single stroke, every foreign mining license was revoked. The Burkina Faso National Mining Company, a state-owned enterprise, would take full control of extraction, refining, and export. 70% of profits would go directly into education, healthcare, infrastructure, and clean water. The other 30% would be reinvested into mining technology and environmental restoration. I still remember walking through the market that day. The air was thick with a mix of celebration and disbelief. A man selling peanuts told me, "I've lived long enough to see our gold leave for Paris. Now I'll live to see it build schools in my own village." But the move sparked a firestorm abroad. French newspapers called it modern piracy. The IMF warned of economic isolation. Business analysts in New York said Africa was sending the wrong message to investors. For my American friends, think of the 1930s New Deal when Roosevelt took on Wall Street, but imagine him also nationalizing entire industries that foreign powers had controlled for decades. Some would call it visionary. Others would call it dangerous. Here's the part few expected. Traoré's government didn't just keep the gold in vaults. Within weeks, bulldozers were breaking ground on schools in mining towns, clinics were opening in rural areas, and wells were being dug where women once walked miles for water. Salaries for miners jumped from $50 to $500 a month. Child labor, gone, banned outright, with inspectors ensuring it stayed that way. Yet controversy simmered under the surface. Could a state-owned company run these operations efficiently? Would corruption creep in, replacing foreign exploitation with domestic greed? And most dangerous of all, would powerful nations now see Burkina Faso as a threat worth crushing? In the cafes, in the markets, even in my own family, the debates raged. But one thing was certain. For the first time in decades, the gold leaving Burkina Faso was ours to decide what to do with. If you believe a nation's resources should never be hostage to foreign powers, let me know in the comments. And share this, because the ripples from this decision wouldn't stop at our borders. It didn't take long for the shockwaves to hit. Within weeks of Traoré's announcement, African leaders from Mali to Guinea began calling emergency meetings. What started as whispers in diplomatic hallways turned into public declarations. In Bamako, Mali's president stood before his parliament and said, "If Burkina Faso can reclaim its gold, so can we." Days later, Mali arrested 2 executives from a French uranium firm. Guinea followed, tearing up mining contracts that had been signed in secret during the last administration. In Niger, the government announced it was taking full control of its uranium mines, the same mines that powered French nuclear plants for decades, while Niger's villages sat in darkness. To my friends in America, imagine if every Latin American nation all at once decided to kick out U.S. oil companies and nationalize their resources. That's the scale of what was happening here. The French government called it an attack on legitimate international business. But Africans called it something else: freedom. Across the continent, people poured into the streets waving not just their national flags, but the flag of a united Africa. Yet, the controversy deepened. Western investors pulled billions from African markets, spooking local economies. Sanctions were whispered about in Brussels and Washington. Rumors of covert plans to restore stability, the polite term for regime change, began to swirl. And then came the most defiant gesture of all. At a Pan-African summit in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood alongside other leaders and said, "If one of us is attacked for defending our land, all of us will respond." That statement sent shivers through Paris, and, let's be honest, through Washington too. I stood in the crowd that day, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. It wasn't just about gold anymore. It was about a continent waking up from a long sleep. If you think African nations have the right to decide their own destiny without permission from Paris, London, or Washington, say it loud in the comments. And share this, vui, because the final chapter of this story shows exactly how high the stakes have become. It was only a matter of time before Paris hit back openly. Standing at a podium in the Élysée Palace, Emmanuel Macron's face was tight, his words sharp. Burkina Faso's actions are reckless. They jeopardize regional stability and harm the very people they claim to help. To us, it sounded like the same tired script, the same lines France had used for decades to justify its grip on Africa. But this time, the response didn't come from a diplomat or a carefully worded press release. It came from Traoré himself, and it was as blunt as the harm we had endured. "Say colonizers, not investors. We will not be lectured by those who grew rich from our suffering. Keep your aid. We'll build our future with our own gold." The statement was broadcast live, and within minutes, clips were circulating worldwide. In Paris, outrage. In Ouagadougou, pride. In New York, the debate lit up cable news. Was Traoré a visionary leader fighting for sovereignty, or a dangerous populist risking his country's future? For my American friends, think of the fiery speeches during the American Revolution, when the colonies told Britain they would no longer obey. That's what it felt like. Except this time, the empire was France, and the rebellion was African. But here's where the controversy refuses to die. Some argue that standing up to Paris will bring nothing but isolation, sanctions, maybe even military intervention. Others say we have no choice, that dignity is worth the risk, that survival without sovereignty is not living at all. I can tell you this. As a citizen, I've seen more hope in the eyes of my neighbors these past months than in the last 30 years. But I've also seen the unease, the quiet questions whispered over tea. Will they try to take it all back? Maybe they will. Maybe they're already planning it. But after watching our gold return, our people rise, and our leaders stand eye to eye with a president who once spoke of us as if we were children. I believe something has shifted forever. So now I'll ask you, whether you're in Africa, America, or anywhere in between, whose side are you on? The side that says our destiny is ours? Or the side that says we need permission to be free? If you stand with us, make your voice heard in the comments. Share this story, and never forget, the chains they place on a nation's wealth are the same chains they place on its people.